Greetings from the FedEx Global Education Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm Barbara Stephenson, and I'm the Vice Provost for Global Affairs and the Chief Global Officer here at UNC. A big part of our mission at this leading global public research university is to educate the next generation of leaders. And those leaders will, by definition, be global leaders. As we pursue that mission, I am proud and honored to be joined tonight by esteemed colleagues who've had distinguished careers in the U.S. Foreign Service and in international affairs. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you who are joining us tonight to the annual Joseph J. Sisco Memorial Forum, hosted in collaboration with the American Academy of Diplomacy. During tonight's discussion of diplomacy in a world of transnational crisis, we will, in keeping with the mission of the American Academy of Diplomacy, return repeatedly to this idea that good policy, while necessary, is not sufficient, because policies are not self-implementing. To be successful, we need both good policy and effective diplomacy, which we can define tonight as the means for executing policy. I'd like to thank the American Academy of Diplomacy and the Sisco Family Charitable Fund for making tonight's forum possible. I would also like to thank colleagues here at UNC for their support of tonight's event. UNC has remarkable strength in area studies, with more national resource centers than any other university in the Southeast. And those area studies centers have turned out tonight in force. And I offer my thanks to the African Studies Center, the Carolina Asia Center, the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies, the Center for European Studies, the Institute for the Study of the Americas, and the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies. I also want to thank the Study Abroad Office, the Global Research Institute, Global Relations, the Political Science and Public Policy Departments, and the Curriculum in Global Studies, as well as the Curriculum in Peace, War, and Defense. I'd like to recognize and thank our keynote speaker, Ambassador Thomas R. Pickering, who served as ambassador under 6 U.S. presidents in a distinguished diplomatic career spanning 5 decades. I would also like to thank our panelists, Ambassador Kathleen Stevens and Dr. J. Stephen Morrison. I count Tom and Kathy among my most transformative mentors during my own Foreign Service career, and I hope some of their wisdom stays with you, the next generation of leaders, for years to come. I would also like to thank Dr. Carol Sisco for joining us. Dr. Sisco, it is an honor to recognize your father's service with this timely conversation. And finally, I'd like to say thank you to Ambassador Ronald Newman, President of the American Academy of Diplomacy and former U.S. Ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and Afghanistan. Ron will moderate tonight's discussion. Thank you, Ron, for inviting Carolina to collaborate with you on this forum. Ambassador Newman began his service to the U.S. as an Army infantry officer in Vietnam, and he joined the U.S. Department of State as a Foreign Service officer in 1970. He spent much of his diplomatic career serving in the Middle East and North Africa. Most recently, with the Academy, he continues his service by fighting hard to maintain adequate funding for state and USAID to ensure that these institutions have the resources and capacity needed to successfully carry out their responsibilities. I will now hand this over to Ambassador Newman. Thank you.
Barbara, thank you very much. And thank you to UNC-Chapel Hill for hosting us. We were planning originally when we started this to be there in person. That wasn't possible, but we're looking forward to being with you next year in person, God willing, in COVID. So first of all, my thanks to Ambassador Stephenson, the Vice Provost for Global Affairs. I also want to thank her assistants, Katie Bowler-Young and Ingrid Smith, as well as my able team of Maria Reisutz and Destiny Clement, who have been working behind the scenes and continue to work and without whom we wouldn't be operating. So in that regard, I also want to echo Barbara's thanks to Carol Sisco, who has been such a loyal friend to the Academy and now a member, and without whose help this forum wouldn't be possible. The American Academy of Diplomacy is a nonprofit and a nonpartisan organization. It is dedicated to strengthening American diplomacy, and it has a small membership of former senior diplomats. Tonight, our theme is diplomacy in the world of transnational crisis. And we picked that because it seemed to be a theme. Well, one thing, it was a theme that was very suitable for a university that has a major in peace, war, and defense. That seems to kind of cover a lot of things that need diplomacy to support them. But additionally, it gets at the challenges that are coming up. And I don't think one has to spend a lot of time on this. You can simply look around. You can see that there are multiple crises and challenges that currently require more than one nation to solve. They're just not going to be solved on a national basis. Obviously, the pandemic, hardly need to illustrate that, but we've had pandemics before and we're likely to have some again. So it's not a one-time event. Climate change, fires burning in the West, the organization of trade and alliances, all of these things are going to require transnational cooperation. Now, clearly, this is a large subject. It would fill a seminar, or perhaps a semester, or perhaps many seminars, but we're not going to try to do everything tonight. But in order to get us into framework into which our individual presentations can fit, it's my great pleasure to introduce one of America's really stellar diplomats, Ambassador Thomas R. Pickering. His full and lengthy bio, I think, is online. He has been Undersecretary of State. He has been ambassador 7 times, including to Russia and to the UN, where he was a central player in building a coalition of states to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait in the first Gulf War. He is a counselor to many on the boards of more organizations that I can count, a man of incredible energy and thought, and I'm glad to say, the chairman of the American Academy of Diplomacy. So, Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Ron, very much. I hope you're hearing me. I'm very much indebted to you, to Barbara, to Carol Sisco for her kindness and generosity, and for everyone at the University of North Carolina. And it's an honor and pleasure to join Ambassador Stevens and Dr. Morrison tonight, both of whom I respect very much for their distinguished service. I thought I would begin by trying to bound the problem a little bit and talk about the challenges ahead very briefly, but hopefully in a way that can then take us to a second stage. What is expected of American diplomacy, and what is it that we should be doing better these days than we have been over the last couple of decades to meet these challenges? And there's a limited amount of time, and so I will skip through this, but hopefully with your interest in mind in the future of our country and the enormous importance of foreign affairs to our national security and indeed to our safety and prosperity as one of the world's greatest, if not greatest, countries. Out and ahead of us are more problems than I have ever seen accumulated at any particular time since I became aware of problems as a very young man in the 1940s. And these include the immediate and serious challenge of what I guess is best called the interrelated trifecta that's upon us. What do we do about a pandemic virus that kills and does so with large numbers of people and for which there is no ready-to-hand therapy, a growing interest in such, and a growing interest as well in a vaccine which can be an effective prophylactic, none of which are with us, and some of which will undoubtedly take more time than any of us would like to see spent upon them. The second interrelated problem is what this pandemic has done to our economy and how and in what way we will seek to recover. There is a home truth, I think, that we cannot recover the economy without recovering our health. Happily, we are suited well enough in our present economy, I believe, to make major strides in dealing with our health. And neither of them can be dealt with without dealing with friends, allies, and indeed enemies in the international community. And that's what, in effect, the diplomats are supposed to do, and indeed what they must do. The third leg of the trifecta is a national problem, not unique to us, but it is racism and discrimination across a wide variety of unfortunate issues and problems that over a course of time have been present among us since the beginning of the country, but about which we have sought to meet the challenges in ways that we all have to conclude, I think, in a moment of great truth, with ineffectiveness. And so out ahead of us is the necessity to deal with the diversity of a great country and to make it not a gaping wound in the flesh of the body politic, but what I would call a singularly strong and significant muscle in our own bodily capacity and in our own mental capacity to continue to lead the world and to continue to be an exemplary state. Next to these, if I were looking at the challenges that will face the next President of the United States, whoever that might be, I would say there will be a very, very important need to deal with a wide variety of current and getting worse problems. The Middle East among them, but problems with China and Russia, with indeed rivals and partners in the global context of a continental character who in one way or another can shake the foundations of the world. If not alone, they are unable to cure the obviously rampant ills of the planet and humanity, but they are important. We need to deal with weapons of mass destruction. We need to deal with economic recovery, which will be extremely important. And we need to deal with all of this, as Ron and Barbara have said to us, dealing with our friends and allies in alliances and in coalitions, and indeed in gathering together what it is that we need to find is necessary to meet the challenges. There will be as well, without adding too much of a note of political strife in this period of elections, with in fact the failures of recent years. And I do not assign those uniquely to any single administration, but feel that we know enough of what we have seen to see a deep and important gulf in strategy. If strategy is indeed premised on knowing your objectives and clearly being able to prioritize them, and then to gather the money and the personnel necessary to treat with them, we have not done very well in recent years to meet these challenges, and they will be very important. And then lest we think that the world is made up for us of four-year political cycles in which we can return, if we don't like the current cycle, back to the beginning of the four-year period, we should be immensely conscious that this world is more dynamic, more split, more fractured, more, I think, failed and failing in many states around the globe, more tortured by fundamental questions running from hunger and water and poverty through the wide gamut of the human, social, and economic condition. And these all need to be addressed, and addressing these globally and internationally is extremely important in the globe. I finally think that among these other questions that are out there, which are increasingly going to take a pride of place among politics and economics as some of the primary preoccupations of diplomats, will be questions such as energy and climate change and dealing with our environment, as well as a great number of social derivatives of some of the failings that we have begun to undertake. For a long time and prior to the present pandemic, we were consumed in many ways with thinking about, are we living in a failed social order, and will there be a new replacement? And how and in what way will that affect our diplomacy? I don't know the answer to that question with the kind of succinctness and directness that I would want to address you with it. What I will say is what has become called the liberal progressive international order was for many people neither liberal nor progressive. For many other people it was. It was an order that in many ways admitted a large role for capitalism, but it did not distinguish and eliminate the nature of the need for governments to balance the question of economic efficiency, perhaps best achieved in a ruthless economy, with the absolute need for social justice, which met many of the imperatives of our Declaration of Independence. And that role, in many ways, was assigned to governments, to legislatures, to courts, and to the executives. And here we are, struggling with that as much as we ever have. I will tell you one thing I'm certain of, however, that autocratic dictatorships are not a valid replacement for an order that is based on democracy, that is based on a wide variety of players, that is based on human principles which we hold dear in this country and which are part of the objective of our national survival and existence. And indeed, for the United States, one could well say that we have the world's greatest military to protect us. And we have certainly the world's greatest economy in many ways, although China may be rivaling us, obviously to assure our prosperity. But we frequently never think about or talk about the principles we espouse, which we often fail to keep up with, but which are in many ways so fundamental to our national character and the offer we have to our people and indeed to the people we associate with. Diplomacy plays a major role in almost all of this. Any who think we can go and hide in a cave and escape indeed the influence of the world on us and our influence on the world are living in an age that has long since passed us by. And things that happen all over in many ways are of striking importance to us. The pandemic only shows us that in another somewhat malign way, obviously, but it also charges us to have an international approach to dealing with it. And one of our failings today may well be that we have neither a national policy on the pandemic, which is gathering all 50 of our states and our 6 or 7 territories in a comprehensive national effort, but also we have not stepped forward in the international domain to use what we know and what we hope we can learn, working with others to make it happen. We have, in many ways, obviously a dual challenge as diplomats. How and in what way can we help our president and indeed the cabinet and those who must make the major decisions to produce the best of foreign policy, and our experience as diplomats and our lives overseas and our capabilities are all part of that mix. But as Ron and Barbara have said, that takes up a relatively small piece of our time, but no American policy I have ever seen is self-executing. We have to daily work at tending what George Shultz used to call the diplomatic garden, to make all of that happen, and to make it happen in the best possible way for us and for our neighborhood, and indeed for the international community within which we live, because they all have an effect upon us. I had the special experience of working for 5.5 years for one of America's great companies. And it was so clear that company, our sole major manufacturer of commercial airplanes, could not exist without selling its products overseas. But it also became immediately apparent to me that it couldn't work effectively and efficiently without working in the overseas markets, and indeed its capacity to sell better and to produce better aircraft related heavily to what those overseas capacities contribute. People like to buy products they believe their country has had a role in producing. And so in so many ways, that lesson plays out now as we look across trade, as we look at the importance to our economy of how we participate in the international sphere. This requires first-class diplomats. And in many ways, we have been through 2 decades in which, behind the scenes at least, one had the feeling that the national leadership had somehow given up on diplomacy and felt that an effective, salient, rapier-like use of the military instrument was going to cure all those problems that the diplomats had so much trouble struggling with. And I'll be the first to admit that diplomacy is not a slot machine. And you put some input into the slot, and out comes a product already made and done, bright and shining in the sunlight, and ready, in fact, to change the world. It is long, difficult, and hard work. I've spent time in the military. I know something about their capabilities. I have the greatest admiration for them, but I also have come to learn that the military's capacity to defend us are absolutely essential. And indeed, that capacity to defend us plays an enormous role in how and in what way we as diplomats can bring together the leverage necessary through negotiation and through discussion and through planning and through implementation of programs achieve our national interests. Years ago, someone asked Harry Truman, a haberdasher from Missouri, an artillery captain in the First World War, and someone who grew out of machine politics in the state of Missouri, what our vital interests were as Americans. And he said, after a little thought, very succinctly, survival and prosperity. And I mentioned them earlier in this talk, but they're significant because they're important, and they're important because they help us define what our strategic imperatives are. And diplomacy must be linked closely to strategy. And strategy, I have to say, needs to combine the whole of the efforts of the government of the United States to achieve its objectives. We have been living in an age for some time, even when our leadership has been important, and I believe that day will return, because as I go around the world, every time there is a new problem, the first question is, what are the Americans going to do about it? And so here we are looking at what we can do to bring people who, like you, are now studying a wide variety of subjects into the public service and to help us specifically with the challenges overseas. We need diversity. We need wisdom and knowledge. We need people willing to work hard. We need people who are willing every day to learn something new, because the challenges of diplomacy are never still. And every American diplomat is in many ways constantly challenged to become expert at whatever subject he is challenged or she is challenged with dealing with. No good diplomat, in my view, has been found wanting in the knowledge of the factors and the subjects that he or she either has to sell to a foreign leader or bring to the attention of a foreign government or provide them reasons why, in the course of implementing our policy, they should join us. Finally, we have lived with alliances and friends. Washington warned us against them. Woodrow Wilson took us into them. They have become, in many ways, part of a major instrument of American diplomacy. Whether we exercise it through the UN or NATO, or with the European Union, or with a myriad of other friends and constellations of friends around the world. We should never lose what I thought I saw as best in our alliance relationships during the Cold War. We need to listen to our friends. We need to digest their ideas. We need to give them the kind of standing dignity and respect that they expect to have and they constantly lend to us. Too much of American recent diplomacy has been, we know better. We're way ahead of you. We think more significantly than you do. And we really don't care to hear your ideas. All we need is your coin in the box and your shoulder behind the wheel. These are not winning days. So out there ahead of us, we have huge challenges. It is young people like you who are spending time at your wonderful university absorbing those challenges, understanding them. And come and join us. Even those who of us have retired a long time ago feel we are still part of the gang. And become part of the people who will lead the next decades, the next generations of the United States in the way in which it ought to perform in the world. A country that can be a shining city on the hill, a country that should in every way show its respect for all of mankind, and a country which beyond doubt can do wonderful things. Thank you for the time, for the efforts to put a few thoughts on the table before you, and indeed for what I know is your interest in the panel to come, and hopefully in the question and answer period that is to follow, and I look forward to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm only sorry that the setup in Zoom does not permit you to hear the thunderous applause, which I know would be out there. But that's one of the small debilities in communicating this way. I need to remind the listeners to put questions in terms of the Q&A function, and we will get to as many as we can. We have about 15 minutes now to continue with Ambassador Pickering before we turn to the panel. And I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to start off with one, which I have from the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies at UNC-Chapel Hill. And that question asks about the recent, or actually not recent because it's about to be signed tomorrow, agreements between Israel and the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Israel and Bahrain. This is something that the Trump administration has been very much a part of, and they're going to be signed at the White House tomorrow. And the question which the Middle East Center has asked is, in your opinion, how significant are these developments, and what impact, if any, will they have on the region?
I think they're significant both in a positive and negative way. And the impact they will have on the region, I think, remains to be seen, but we can at least foresee some of those impacts. In a positive way, obviously, for us, with our very close relationship with Israel, the fact that Israel gains from among the Arab states in the region where it is located a diplomatic opportunity, in fact, to share on a mutual basis the good relationship that clearly must exist between states in a region if they are indeed going to live together without continuing conflict. And that's particularly important. There are two side effects of this that in one way or another are significant to the Israelis and to the United Arab Emirates. I know less about the Bahrain agreement, and Ron, having been ambassador in Bahrain, could probably do a much better job than I can with that. But with the UAE, there certainly is an important concern shared widely in the region among the Arab states of the Gulf, in particular about Iran. And that is also widely shared with Israel. And so the notion that, in fact, we have an increasing set of countries that are close to us who will be close together in dealing with Iran is very important. I do not share the view that we are inevitably doomed to have a conflict with Iran. I long shared the view that the arrangement made under the Obama administration to deal with their nuclear program, while far from perfect, was so much far further ahead than a nothing arrangement that we should hang on to it and do our best to make it better. Whether this arrangement between the UAE and Israel will once again become something that deprecates a deal with Iran and does not choose to help us make it better or not remains open. Secondly, there's the question of Israel-Arab peace. This deal came out as a peace treaty, but the major elements where peace is needed, as we all have known for years, is between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And this particular arrangement on the UAE side means, in fact, that the UAE has departed from an Arab League point of view, that they would not have relationships of a diplomatic character with Israel until such time as the Palestinians were able to have their state, however that might be worked out. And that, of course, in many ways hurts any need for progress or notion of progress in that area. But it is also true, in my humble view, that the Palestinians themselves have failed to pull themselves together seriously enough to offer new opportunities for that negotiation. And in many ways, the present course of the Israeli government is in a different direction. The third thing is the question of how and in what way does the deal affect Israel's approach to annexation. I have to say, unfortunately, encouraged by the elements that relate to that in the peace plan offered by the current administration to the region. If it is indeed, as the UAE likes to think, a delay certainly until 2024, that is a positive advantage in opening the door to negotiations between Israel and Palestine, which now seems to be totally welded shut. Obviously, it will take others to help in making that happen. So that is clearly a point. This will be, I think, very helpful to Prime Minister Netanyahu in his present situation. He's here. He will be part of the signing ceremony. It will be seen as a great achievement on his part, and indeed it is. All Israeli prime ministers have in one way or another struggled to open the door to relationships with Arab countries in their region. So that's the good and that's the bad. How it will all work out is hard to see. Whether indeed Bahrain will be followed by others, and if so, who is open. I saw the Omanis were kind enough to congratulate Bahrain today. The King of Saudi Arabia has said he will stick with the notion that no diplomatic relations without a Palestinian state. So we'll see where all of that takes it. Finally, obviously, it's good for American business. If you have investments in American fighter planes, a sale of F-35s to the United Arab Emirates is something that will help your stock. In other ways, it's probably good for security in the region. Having the first-class American Joint Strike Fighter in the hands of friends and allies who can use it effectively to defend themselves in the region will be an important addition to security.
Tom, thank you very much. You know, you mentioned that I've been in Bahrain, and it strikes me there's perhaps one other element in this, and that is how the Arab states, particularly the UAE and Bahrain, read their dependence on the United States. Because after all, their fears of Iran have been very long-standing, and they never needed this policy before. And I somewhat suspect that the period where they felt that we moved too close to Iran in the Obama administration and that we're feckless in this administration has left them with a sense that they need another arrow in their quiver. Whether that will be good for stability or bad, I have no idea, but it certainly makes it an interesting question. We have a question for you from the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies, which asks you to go in a different direction, and that is, as a former ambassador to Russia, do you see a way out of the current extremely poor relations with Russia? And if so, what would it look like? And I know you have just been writing on that subject.
I have, and thanks, Ron, and it's an extremely good and important question, and not an easy one. I joined 6 other Americans with experience in Russia a month ago in a letter that said basically 2 things. We need to be able to be sure that we continue to keep the pressure and the heat on Russia and do so in smart and useful ways, while at the same time we work to see whether, in fact, we can use the leverage so generated as a way of achieving at least some forward movement in issues in which we both share some kind of clear ambition. And we all know, harping back to the 1960s and the Cuban Missile Crisis, that it was important for the then Soviet Union and the United States to draw the lesson from that near approach to nuclear calamity, perhaps in historical study closer than we thought even at the time, to do everything we could in the area of arms control to try to build stability and to try to build predictability and transparency into the nuclear relationship. We are now in the course of tearing that down, and we have but one remaining arms control agreement left, New START, and it does not look as if that is likely to survive. It either has to be extended in early February 2021 or it goes away. And Russia has indicated pretty consistently an interest in extending that. We'll have to see where we go, but I think no secondary consideration of China or other issues should stand in the way of extending that. Those other considerations can be considered in the context of a continued, more stable U.S.-Russia nuclear relationship. And that relationship has been the center of areas when we enjoyed a better relationship with Russia. There's no reason why it cannot continue to play that role now.
So there, now I can thank you. I'm unmuted. I know several people have asked, we've only got a couple minutes till we have to turn to the panel, but I've had questions about what it was that caused you to look to a career in diplomacy. And when did you turn on to this idea, which you've made such a stellar contribution?
Well, thank you for the kind words, but I think as a youngster, I got very interested in reading and reading about things that were going in the world. My mother gave me a book at the time I was sick in bed with measles, one on what was happening all around the world when George Washington was alive, and the second with Abraham Lincoln. And there were places I had never heard of and issues I'd never even thought about or heard about that came to my attention. I suppose it was that one little trigger that fastened in my mind a couple of things. One, it was a good thing to serve your country. I grew up and was too young to serve in the Second World War, but admired the spirit of the country, the enormous sense of service that millions of people gave to the country at that time, and how important that was as an objective in one's life. And then secondly, I became very interested not just in the military aspects of our government, but how and in what way we could help to build a more stable, more secure world for ourselves, and obviously for others living in it. And so those two things attracted me in college. A couple of my professors said, "Why didn't I take the Foreign Service exam?" I said, "I already had planned to. Thank you for the reinforcement." And that was the beginning.
Tom, I believe, according to the schedule that we agreed with the university, it is time for us to move to the panel. And so let me say to our audience, because we had an enormous number of additional questions, and maybe we could get a few of them in, because Ambassador Pickering has agreed that he will come back with the panel to field questions afterwards. But I wanted to explain what we're doing with the panel, because as you've seen, this is a vast subject, and we could go in all kinds of directions with this subject. But what we decided to do was to try to take three slices of the pie to pick out three areas to talk about in particular, to give you, the audience, a sense of what this business of diplomacy in a transnational period is like. And so we're going to look at three different aspects. One is how the world needs to organize to face disease. This is not a new experience for us. We've done it, faced it before, and we will almost certainly face it again. Secondly, we're going to take a very different switch. We're going to take a look at Asia and simply take one of many areas of the world where we could focus to give you a sense of the kind of challenges America must organize to deal with. And lastly, we've drawn your own Vice Chancellor, Ambassador Stephenson, in as the third panelist, who's going to talk about the tools of statecraft and what these challenges will require in organization and the fielding of our diplomacy. Now, obviously, we could go in a lot of directions, but we have a particular issue here we want to get at, and that is all of these things we're going to talk about will have a great deal to do with policy. But we want to point out and emphasize that there is a difference between policy and diplomacy. That difference is often obfuscated or missed in editorials, and people will use policy and diplomacy as though they are interchangeable. But they're not interchangeable, because policy is the description of a goal, of where you're trying to go. And diplomacy is about how one reaches the goal, how the policy is executed. And this distinction is critical, because if the execution is incompetent, if the diplomacy is too badly flawed, then the goal will not be reached, no matter how intellectually correct the selection of the goal is. And that's what makes the diplomacy part particularly worth focusing on and understanding. And explaining that is a key to emphasizing why we need an effective diplomacy, not just changes to policy. So with that framing of what I've asked our panelists to do, I'm going to first, I'll just introduce all of them quickly. We're going to first turn to Stephen Morrison, who is the Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at CSIS. He has directed the Global Health Policy Center, which he founded in 2008. He directed the CSIS Task Force on HIV/AIDS. He has conceptualized and founded the USAID's Office of Transitional Initiatives. And we couldn't have he served, by the way, in Africa as well. So he's practiced what he preaches. We couldn't have a better person to look at the issue of pandemics. He's going to be followed by Kathleen Stevens, Ambassador Kathleen Stevens. She is the president, CEO of the Korean Economic Institute of America. She's a former U.S. ambassador to Korea and many other posts. She was also chargé, that is running the embassy in India. And she's had many senior positions. Interestingly, when she was U.S. Consul General in Belfast, that was during the negotiations which culminated in the 1998 Global Good Friday Agreement. And I raise that because it has an interesting connection to our last panelist, Ambassador Stephenson, Chapel Hill's own Vice Provost for Global Affairs. Now, Ambassador Stephenson has been ambassador to Panama. She's been president of the American Foreign Service Association for 2 terms, and I can tell you that kept her busy with these issues of proper diplomacy. She was the first woman to serve as the deputy ambassador and acting ambassador at our embassy in London. But earlier, and this is the connection with Ambassador Stevens, she was the American Consul General. She was also the American Consul General in Belfast, where she helped to renew support for the Good Friday Agreement that brought an end to the decades of violence. So you can see that these careers move in many, many different directions. And with that, I'm going to turn to Dr. Morrison, and Stephen, over to you. You're muted.
Can you hear me? You can hear me now. Great. Ambassador Newman, thank you so much. I'm going to speak for just 8 or 10 minutes maximum and touch on a few points about the interrelationship between diplomacy capacity, and this notion around pandemic threats. And the history is mixed in that regard, but it's also a very rich and honorable tradition. And I'll start by talking about HIV/AIDS and the transformation that happened in 2003 when then President Bush announced the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. It was in the midst of a great crisis. The threat was very apparent to global stability, but particularly to the stability of states, societies in Eastern and Southern Africa. President Bush was reformulating at that time post 9/11 national security strategy and put out a document in 2002, fall of 2002, right before this, talking about how the threat of infectious diseases had been elevated as a priority concern. So he launches this program. It's now been ongoing for 17 years, 25 million people on life-sustaining therapy, $90 billion expended. It's the grandest and most successful experimentation and initiative by the U.S. government or any other government in terms of infectious diseases, and it rested on continuous high-level leadership, starting with the president, but it relied on our chiefs of mission as the point of contact within the country and managing the relationships, coordinating the different agencies that were the implementers, and bringing about that look that communicated to the partner country that this was in service of that partner country, and this was a key part of our relationship, and that the diplomats in charge had lead responsibility in moving this forward. And that remains true to this day. I want to also skip forward for a bit to the Ebola crisis of 2014 and 15, in which we deployed 2,800 U.S. troops into Liberia. We were quite engaged in that period, and it was the chiefs of mission. It was Deborah Malik in Liberia. It was Alex Lascaris in Guinea, John Hoover in Sierra Leone, who were playing the lead, vitally important lead roles in that period. So these historic moments have demonstrated just how important diplomacy is operationally down to the ground level, but also starting at the level of the Secretary of State. It was embodied in the head of PEPFAR. PEPFAR was placed within the Department of State with an ambassador in charge, currently Deborah Birx, who's also now been deployed into the response on COVID. Now, my second point is, however, these kinds of grand threats come and go, and there is a tendency in our policy and others to be subject to a cycle of crisis followed by complacency and neglect. And so the PEPFAR program carried on, but State Department writ large has not had a very strong and leadership role until recently on many of these matters. When the Ebola outbreak occurred in DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, starting in 2018, there was a Benghazi effect. There was a fear of deploying into the center of the outbreak, and our diplomats and our key experts were kept out of that. So it's not always guaranteed that our capacities, that our readiness, that our knowledge and expertise gets carried forward. Interestingly, in the midst of the COVID outbreak, there's a new line of thought that you can see in both the Senate on the Republican and Democratic side, as well as in Secretary Pompeo and his dialogue with the White House about positioning the Department of State again to be the lead entity in guiding the global health security strategy outside our borders. So we're in a renewed period of thinking about this. It's still in formation, but we've come back to the idea that guided the PEPFAR program now today in the midst of this. I'll say just some few words that are quite negative about where we are today. As Ambassador Pickering pointed out, we have not engaged outside of our borders in a significant and serious fashion to try and lead and guide and coordinate the global response as we would have in previous outbreaks of pandemic flu, of SARS, and other things. At home, of course, we have failed, had a series of catastrophic failures, and we have been pinned down, as most other countries in the world have been, coping with the reality of this pandemic. We have chosen in the international approach on this to define it as part of our grand confrontation with China, which is an unraveling geostrategic relationship. We have severed our relationship with WHO because we have cast WHO as accomplices to the Chinese. We have not participated in the initiatives that the EU and others have launched, the ACT Accelerator, the COVAX vaccine facility, attempting to make sure that vaccines along with therapies and diagnostics are brought forward in an affordable and timely way to low and lower middle income countries that are going to need them in order to get control over their outbreaks. So we have right now a situation of a sort of hyper-nationalist process of hoarding and pre-purchasing of the vaccines. 4 billion doses have been bought, largely overwhelmingly to serve the interests of those countries that are buying them, which are the wealthier countries. And there's great uncertainty around whether there will be solutions struck at a diplomatic level that can bring justice and equity and access and a solution outside our borders in low and middle income countries. Last point is there are panels already being put in place to deliberate on these matters. There is the International Pandemic Preparedness Response Panel that has just been stood up, headed by two heads of state, former heads of state, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and Helen Clark. and it is going to deliberate over the response and what the future requires. And I believe a top element of its deliberations will be the need for much higher investments in diplomacy and grand initiatives as statesmanship dedicated to trying to resolve both the response and the delivery of vaccines and all of the attendant economic and humanitarian crises that are driving from this. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Steve, thank you very much. I think you have certainly underlined the interrelationship between policy and all the moving parts that people have, namely diplomats, have to carry out to keep it moving forward. Now we're going to switch our focus in particular, although the broad focus of the future needs of diplomacy remains, and we're going to ask Ambassador Kathleen Stevens to pick this up with a look at least a few of the questions in Asia.
Well, thank you, Ron. Thank you, Ambassador Newman, and thank you very much, Barbara, for the invitation to join you today. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm reporting you to from the smoke-filled skies of Troy, Montana, where I had been thinking about the relationship between diplomacy and policy and theory, and I will try to focus on Asia and as kind of a case study, if you like, of American diplomacy. I joined the Foreign Service in 1978. That's actually right before the US and China normalized fully our diplomatic relationship. And so, like, I think others, not just diplomats, but Americans of my generation, I've seen the rise, not just of China, but the importance of Asia to the United States, to our economy, to our culture, to our people, and certainly Asia. And by this now, I mean the Indo-Pacific, as we tend to call it now, rather than just Asia-Pacific, including India and South Asia, loom ever larger for our country, including some of the world's largest economies, accounting until the pandemic in recent years for 2/3 of global economic growth, 60% and growing of global gross domestic product. We see where the trend lines are. Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific is of course home to some of the world's largest and most advanced militaries, several nuclear powers. And when it comes to one of the topics we're really looking at today, these transnational issues, whether it's pandemics and global health, climate change, cybersecurity, or a whole host of others that know no borders, I don't think anyone, whatever one's policy predilections are, can imagine effective policy, effective answers that don't include some kind of involvement, engagement, cooperation from Asia and major Asian powers, including China. In fact, this is not news to any of you, I think, and in fact, both the Obama administration and the Trump administration explicitly recognized this. In the Obama administration, we had a policy that was labeled the rebalance to Asia. It was not to say we didn't pay attention before. I was there for the Bush administration too, but a conscious effort to rebalance our diplomatic as well as our military efforts and engagement with Asia. And the Trump administration, it's under the rubric of the free and open Indo-Pacific. But this, of course, is also in the context of the world as it changes. It's already been alluded to by Ambassador Pickering and others. We have a China that has not only become more powerful, but also under Xi Jinping's leadership since 2012, more assertive. In many ways, very distressing, not only to the United States, but to our friends and allies in the area. And at the same time, and particularly I would say under the Trump administration, a sense in the region that US engagement in Asia has been insufficient and unreliable. And certainly this transactional and dismissive approach to allies, I think, has exacerbated this issue, this sense among those who are concerned about China's rise that the US may not be there for them. And the most recent, as Dr. Morrison alluded to, kind of pivot during this pandemic to an even more kind of openly adversarial tone in dealing with China has also created a lot of worry in the region among our friends. On this theme, I was going to say of good policy, while necessary, is not sufficient, and we're here to talk about diplomacy and not policy. I mean, you need both, and I know if you're in a university, you spend a lot of time on theory. I think this is a time when we are rethinking fundamental issues, not only relating to our own country, but relating to our place in the world, our goals in the world. And for that, I welcome the fact that we have a lot of students who are engaged in serious IR studies, economics, regional studies, and so on. But given all that, and I know because I'm already running through most of my moments, I'm going to add to the notion of focusing on the policy of Yogi Berra's advice. For those of you who don't remember the legendary baseball player, the Chinese may have Confucius, but we have Yogi Berra. In theory, there is no difference, he said. In theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. And, no policy is self-executing, as Ambassador Pickering said. We're the practitioners, we diplomats, I always say we're the engineers, we're the people who fail a million times before something works. And that's certainly been the case of American diplomacy in Asia, and I would say throughout the world. But I think we have a lot to build on in terms of US diplomacy in Asia. And I think that American diplomacy tied to, broadly speaking, what I think our policy might be, and I can talk a little bit about that, will continue to be characterized by, and this is two major preoccupations. And this has been true for a long time, but somehow it's even more true now. And one is the obvious, our relationship with China. Right now is at its lowest point since post Tiananmen in 1989. Some would argue even lower than it was then. And therefore the lowest since normalized relations, as I mentioned, in the late 1970s. Now, again, how we carry out diplomacy is related to the policy. And I have to say, I don't subscribe to the apocalyptic view that China is a deadly enemy that must be defeated, or that military conflict with China is inevitable, so there's no point in diplomacy. Very few diplomats will sign up to that. Our job is to try to prevent those worst case outcomes. But I also don't think that the past 40 years of US-China relations have all been some terrible mistake. But clearly we're at a time in this country, and not only because it's election season and because there's a pandemic, that we need to take a very clear and hard-headed reassessment of the US-China relationship, of the US role in Asia. Think about, I would say, where we can find common ground to cooperate. I think we can, we must, but also how we can manage this growing competition, and where we can accommodate, where we really can't. But the second preoccupation of diplomacy in Asia, American diplomacy in Asia, will continue to be managing the web of alliances and partnerships that the US has nurtured and deepened since the end of World War II. Now, this includes formal security alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines. Of course, we have considerable troop presences still in a number of those countries. And we also have a range of, while they're not formal security alliances, really deepened partnerships with a lot of cooperation in recent decades, strengthened with countries from India to Vietnam, Singapore, and elsewhere. And that second part, our allies and partners, I would say throughout the world, as again, others of Ambassador Pickering already mentioned, is the strength of the US in Asia. After World War II, we were not only the security provider in Asia, we were also the major economic partner. That's changed now, of course, in the sense that all of our allies and partners, like ourselves, have a very important economic relations with China, but we continue to be a provider of, I would say, security throughout Asia. You might accept China and perhaps North Korea from that. But basically, you have an Asia with a lot of countries that also don't want to be dominated by China. And in fact, a region where many naysayers of a few decades ago, including in the American diplomatic service, I must say to the contrary, American values of democracy and human rights have really taken root. They've bought the values agenda. And they've also seen the benefits that have accrued to Asian countries, to many, many people in Asia, of the international order, if you want to call it the liberal international order, the trade order, the security order, under US leadership. And the apparent rejection in recent years by the American administration of key elements of that order, not only of alliances, but of that framework, that structure, has been deeply unsettling. For example, the decision at the beginning of the Trump administration to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the multilateral trade agreement, which had been agreed to under the previous administration, was unsettling, and actually forced Japan and other key partners, key economies in Asia to go alone. They actually, interestingly, didn't turn to China and go to the Chinese way. They did their own. And they're doing that actually on a number of trade, economic, and other transnational issues. But clearly, these friends and partners want the US back in the game. And these are highly capable partners. This is a big role for diplomacy going forward. So whether the next administration, whether it's a second term or a new administration continues, there will be some kind of effort to continue a free and open Indo-Pacific, whether it's called that or not. It will need diplomacy to work. It cannot be military alone. Many of these issues I've mentioned are issues that do not lend themselves to military solutions. And actually, as a side note, I would add, I think we discovered during this administration that that the North Korean issue also needs, I would say, more diplomacy, not less. We saw unconventional top-down diplomacy, which I think was worth a try, but the way forward is more diplomacy, not less, and some of it taking place perhaps definitely not at the very top level without adequate gardening and preparing of the ground and working with allies. So just a couple of other final points on that. I think that another point of what diplomats do is we try to manage in Asia these two key areas, the relationship with China, the US-China relationship, but I think probably is the most important bilateral relationship in the world right now, to us, maybe to the world. And secondly, our web of allies and partners. Another part of what diplomats do is actually remind Washington that other countries have views too. I mentioned what Japan and others did on trade with the withdrawal of the US. It was not expected in Washington that they would go out on their own. And I actually welcome that and think it's something that we can now rejoin and build on. But diplomats need to do our best to make sure that we not only transmit, but also receive and then transmit back to Washington what is happening in the world. And it's also, in terms of Asia, clear that if we're going to pick our battles with China, if you like, we're going to do a lot better job of it if we have some other partners on our side. I have many, many friends and colleagues who, at least off the record, if not on the record, if they're still in government, from Asian capitals, who will say, we understand why the US is upset about some of China's practices, whether they're in the South China Sea in terms of freedom of navigation or on trade practices and cyber practices and the rest. We share all that. We want to work with you, but we've often put our allies and friends and potential partners in the situation of having to choose between what I would say is a very punitive China or a very go it alone kind of extreme American view. So again, the policy may have elements that need to be continued, but a lot more diplomacy is needed. I also think it means we need to keep our avenues open to China. And just to give you a very specific example of something that troubles me as tensions with China have heightened, and as Dr. Morrison said, we have not been able to work internationally with other countries in this public health crisis that we're in. I regret the fact that the United States decided to close the Chinese consulate in Houston. I'm quite prepared to accept that they were probably doing some things they shouldn't have been done, and that should have been dealt with in a very, very clear way. But if we get into a tit for tat where we are closing down our ability to communicate with each other, to talk to each other, we're going to lose some of the tools of diplomacy, some of the things in our toolbox which we need to avert conflict and to try to solve problems. So there will be heightened competition and sharp disagreements with China going forward. I mentioned a few. I would also have to mention the Hong Kong, Xinjiang, many things happening on the cyber front. But we can respond best to these when we recruit allies and partners to help us make the case for a different approach. And we must still try to work with China where we can. North Korea would be one area, climate change, public health. But again, all these issues I've listed are ones that do not lend themselves to unilateral approaches or purely military approaches. So I think the time for strengthened diplomacy, you would expect me to say this, really is with us now.
Kathy, thanks. It is a really fine covering of an enormous front and giving people a lot to think about. And it just keeps emphasizing over and over again that you can't just dedicate yourself to these policies. You have to have people to work them. You have to have people who are talking to other governments and who are listening. Yeah, it's a really important point you made. My old mentor, the late Hal Saunders, used to say, in fact, he said so often, they put it on a little polished rock they gave us at his memorial service. And he used to say, listen deeply enough to be changed by what you hear. And it's a terribly important note about how one does diplomacy, which doesn't mean, as we all have to remind colleagues, that students, it doesn't mean that you do what foreigners want. It means you have to know what they want in order to figure out how to get them to do what you want. All of this takes people, and I'm now going to turn to Ambassador Stephenson to talk in a little more detail about the demands and what it means for diplomacy in really concrete terms. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Ron. I'm going to wrap up these panel presentations by returning to that idea that I mentioned in my welcoming remarks. That is, drawing that distinction between policy, which is essentially our goal, and the requirements of diplomacy, how one executes the policy successfully. And that is a definition I draw directly from the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy, Ambassador Newman. The need for effective American diplomacy is pressing. I think Dr. Morrison's presentation on how the U.S. has been present and has provided the leadership, the global leadership in previous pandemics, previous health crises like HIV/AIDS and Ebola reminds us that we are capable of these feats. They are absolutely within our playbook. We just aren't actually playing that coordinating role now. And it's the same thing on some other of these pressing issues that know no borders, things like climate change. One of the great strengths of American diplomacy has always been that remarkable network of alliances that America built. We can talk about it with Europe. Kathy has done a great job of talking about it in Asia. That network of alliances that we have, there is no match for it anywhere else in the world. The Chinese do not have a network like this. The Russians do not. Those alliances are fraying, though, and shoring them up is a key job requirement of diplomats. And keeping alliances strong requires, as Kathy said, not just talking, not just being in the broadcast mode, but also careful listening so that we diplomats understand where our allies are coming from and how they see the world and where they'll be willing to join us and make common cause, and where there are issues where they just cannot make common cause with us. As alliances fray, they require more work from diplomats, more engagement, more talking, and more listening. And as Kathy said too, we discussed this over the weekend, and it actually did not come up tonight. So let me share this idea that long-standing staunch allies such as Australia and Japan and Korea, they are beginning to question American reliability and to hedge their bets. And as our allies, this is happening in Europe as well, we see this. As our allies question the strength of our bonds, that basic goal of diplomacy, which is to get to yes, to find a way to work together, to pursue a common course of action, it becomes much more difficult. So all of these contextual issues add up to a bigger job for American diplomacy. There's just more work to do. And if we want to successfully execute our foreign policy in this environment, we need to up our diplomatic game. So against that backdrop, on August 13, The Economist magazine led its international section with a 3-page examination of the dereliction of American diplomacy under a caption that was "Facing the World Blindfolded." This article was in the reading package that we circulated here at UNC, so I hope some of the students that are joining us tonight had a chance to read it. Let's remember, this is not the Democrats on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who also issued a report called American Diplomacy in Crisis, and I was on their panel. This cannot be dismissed as partisan or Americans obsessing about our leadership role. This is a non-American source leading the international section with a very serious look at the dereliction of American diplomacy. I think we're now in the place where the understanding that our diplomatic capacity has really been weakened has taken hold, and it's no longer debatable. There's another really important part of the context that we're operating in. During much of my career, when Kathy and I were UK desk officers together before we became successors on as Consul General in Belfast, America was in a superpower moment. The Berlin Wall had fallen. We were the sole remaining superpower. That unipolar moment has given way now to a new era of great power competition. Ambassador Pickering referred to this. And I want to make sure that our students note that one particular chart from the Lowy Institute in the Economist article. China recently overtook the United States in one key measure of diplomatic capacity. China now has more embassies and consulates around the world than the United States does. So when it comes to global leadership, there is serious competition out there. And it's for the first time in decades. We have not had serious great power competition, and now we do. So against that background, I just have to say, it is utterly remarkable to me to see sweeping cuts up to 1/3 proposed year after year after year by this administration for diplomacy. And we don't spend much on diplomacy to begin with. America's core diplomatic capability, I'm going to use a few numbers here. It costs us about $5 billion a year. It's not much money. You can buy an aircraft carrier for $13 billion for comparison. So you can fund America's core diplomatic capability, that network of embassies, for about $5 billion a year. We keep shortchanging it, and I have a quote that I often use, which is, "We don't win wars without soldiers." We all get that. We all know that when we're talking about military goals, we need to talk about the troops, the capacity to actually achieve the goal. The same thing is true for diplomacy. We do not win in the foreign policy arena without enough diplomats deployed around the world, able to do all that talking and listening and understanding and advocating and gardening, all of the gardening that George Shultz talked about. It is labor intensive. Here's part of what I find most heartening. As Tom observed, the first question he hears when he is grappling overseas with the problem is, where are the Americans? And Kathy noted that in Asia as well, there's a real desire to get America back in the game. One of my favorite anecdotes is from my travels on the road with Congressman McCall of Texas. We were in Austin together, and he is the ranking Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And he told a story in his home district of being approached by 6 African diplomats. So these are diplomats from African countries posted in Washington, who came to see him to say, you know, we actually would rather work with America rather than with the Chinese, but we actually can't find you. Can you please send us some Americans to work with? So I want you to know that this is a bipartisan story about where are the Americans. I often use a baseball metaphor to describe the moment that we're in. China's at bat, and the US team's got nobody on shortstop or second base, and we're sort of baffled at why it is that the Chinese are just hitting one line drive after another right down the hole that we've got out there. The first thing we could do as Americans, and it would be so utterly cost effective, is to make sure that the US is fielding a full team. I got all kinds of statistics. If any of you in the audience, our students, want to follow up on this or write a master's thesis on it, I'll provide all of it to you. But America's funding on core diplomatic capability has been declining, and it precedes the Trump administration, as the Economist article quotes me as saying, while China's has doubled in about the last 8-10 years. And so we're cutting back on this. America needs a full team out there. And I hope that some of you here at UNC in these area studies programs in peace, war, and defense, in the political science department, the global curriculum, will decide to join that team. For my part, I can say that in my nearly 34 years as an American diplomat, as a US Foreign Service officer, those were just wonderful years that were so well spent. I got to work with remarkable leaders and colleagues, like some of those that are here with us tonight, and represent the U.S. in Northern Ireland, in Panama, the Netherlands, El Salvador. It's a great life. I hope you'll choose it and help us field a full team. And I'm going to stop there because we promised to give you guys time to get your questions answered. Thank you all for participating tonight.
Barbara, thank you. I think if people don't carry away anything else from this, they might carry away the notion that if they choose to go into diplomacy, they will not be bored.
They will not be bored.
So I have a question now, which comes from the curriculum in Peace, War, and Defense at Chapel Hill, which is an interdisciplinary focus to examine questions relating to war, national security, and peacemaking. And I'm going to pass this one to Steve. All of us could probably speak to many of these questions, but if we did, we'd only answer one. So I'm going to use my prerogative to pick and choose. But because so much of the pandemic discussion also involves multinational institutions, I wanted to pitch this one to you, Dr. Morrison. And it notes that we have been backing away from many institutions. We've been denigrating the UN, the WTO. We're pulling out of the World Health Organization. And the question is, can these institutions survive without active and public support from the US? And if not, do you see any future where global governance or global institutions transfers to alternative institutions created by other parties?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Definitely.
You can. Okay, thank you, Ambassador. Let's use the case of WHO. The U.S. government is the largest donor, has been the largest donor to WHO. It's also the partner with the deepest technical collaborations. In other words, even today, there are 22 senior CDC and NIH experts who are detailed to Geneva working within WHO, and we have 22 collaborating institutions at American universities principally that are World Health Organization collaborating institutions, fully a quarter of them that are in the world. So we sever the relationship. It complicates the global polio eradication initiative, which is on the edge. It complicates how do we arrive at what the seasonal flu vaccine is going to look like. It complicates how are we going to set norms and standards about what are safe and effective in essential medicines and the like. And it goes on and on like that. If we follow through, and the decision taken by the president to sever membership takes a year to execute. We've suspended our payments. We're refusing to pay what's in our arrears. How is WHO dealing with that? Well, it's in sadness. It's dealing with it. It's been quiet and not done anything to aggravate the situation, but it moves ahead. It has a job to do. It has a global pandemic in front of it. Other donors have come forward to backfill to some degree the gap created by the removal of the US $450 million a year. The Europeans, the Scandinavians are migrating in support of this. The EU is becoming a much bigger player. And of course, the expectation is that the Chinese, who are professing that they're going to become much bigger players, are anticipating doing that. They've been making claims, making promises. We haven't seen that happen yet. Russia has become a bigger partner with the WHO in recent years, and I expect it will continue in that vein. So these organizations like WHO do not fall apart and disappear, but they are wounded by this, and we are wounded in our own right by that. Similarly, all of the institutions that are now under debate about how to deal with the challenges of bringing 2 doses of vaccines to 7 billion people in the world, 14 billion doses, an unprecedented, complicated, expensive, logistically unimaginable task, that the group, we are not at the table in those debates. We're absent. Yet we are going to likely be bringing forward some of the most promising and effective vaccines, but we're not engaging in any serious way around the delivery and the sharing and the equitable ability to try and get those vaccines to the health workers that need it the most, the other vulnerable populations that need it the most. So we're absent from the stage. My hope, though, is that that absence and that damage to our influence and standing in the world can be corrected. The rest of the world has not turned on us. What we have seen, though, for the first time, is people in the world not just expressing criticism or intimidation of the United States, but expressing pity for our country. And I think that has been a profound thing to witness and to begin to try and digest when countries in the world are expressing pity for what Americans are experiencing at home and abroad. Thank you.
Steve, thank you very much. We are getting an enormous number of questions, but we have a bit of time. There is one which came in from the Carolina Asia Center, which is the flagship Asian Institute of UNC-Chapel Hill. And it's one that I think all of us probably have some strong feelings about, but I'm going to pass it to Barbara because it's particularly up her lane. And it says, as communication becomes increasingly digital and more of our lives happen online, and that, I might say, is true not only of the COVID period, but of also some of the security constraints that we've been laboring under. The question is, should digital engagement come primarily from central offices, that is the Department of State and Foggy Bottom, or from outposts? And I think I would ask you to expand on that a little bit and talk about what are the pluses and the minuses of digital communication for diplomacy. Can we all stay home?
So you've passed that to me, and I'm going to take a quick chop at it, but I'm going to also pass it, if you'll permit me, to Kathy, who is one of our most accomplished practitioners of that, not from the Capitol, but from the embassy. Her work in Seoul is a public diplomacy legend, and she was also our acting undersecretary for public affairs. I think that she'll be absolutely brilliant on this one. Here's my thought. I have rarely seen the one-size-fits-all messages that come out of Washington to land particularly well on foreign soil. I remember when Ambassador Pickering was Undersecretary for Political Affairs and I was his special assistant for Europe, that he launched a great effort to try to get us to say what was the desired outcome that we were seeking and to leave it to the diplomats on the ground to figure out, consult the genius of the place, think about how to describe this, pitch it, to try to get people to make common cause. That the messages that come out of Washington, they're rarely effective. I remain, I realize it may be more effective to just push a Facebook or a Twitter feed. I don't think that they work nearly as well. So I'm going to turn it back to you as our moderator, Ron, but suggest that Ambassador Stevens is a bit of a genius on this topic.
Well, then by all means, we'll bring Kathy in, but I certainly agree with you. The fascination with sending messages doesn't do much if you don't look at the receipt. There's a marvelous study that was done about US and Taliban propaganda in Afghanistan. And a great deal of the American propaganda is completely incomprehensible to Afghans, including messages, cartoons that you can't understand unless you're literate and can read the caption, but a large part of the population is illiterate.
Well, we could ask the Iraqis how they feel about freedom, because we decided to name it Operation Iraqi Freedom. And freedom sounds, you're an Arabic speaker, I'm not, but it sounds a bit like chaos in which my sister doesn't fare well.
Yeah. Well, for that, this proves that we all have opinions on this, but I'm going to pass this to Kathy at this point.
Well, I mean, I agree with all you said. I mean, I don't think the problem in the world today, most places, I mean, you would have different countries that have different challenges in terms of the information that gets in, but generally the issue is not an absence of information, right? We can send out lots of information about US policy and our speeches and why this matters and so on and so forth. The question is, I mean, how do you reach people, and is it credible and is it relevant to them? And I think for those things, I mean, certainly I learned, and I am obviously a digital immigrant at a late age. I have seen in my work in my later years, I mean, some really innovative stuff done by, for example, things like Voice of America in China, where they have reached a Chinese audience with, if you like, some soft messages, you know, that are about things that engage the Chinese. You have to find your audience where they are. So that's true for any communication. But I think for diplomats, I mean, we traditional diplomats, we cannot think that somehow not having people there is, well, that we don't need people there. And really going back to the point we were making earlier, which I think bears remaking, is especially given the American footprint in much of the world, and maybe this is changing now as we leave this unipolar moment. You know, people think they know a lot about the US. Sometimes we don't think they know the right things, and certainly they have a lot of misconceptions, but they actually really want to be heard. And once they think that you're hearing them, and hopefully you are, then they open their head to your message. So if you, and that I found is easier to do personally, but if you can do that digitally, great, but it just cannot be one-way communication. And my worry about digital is it becomes, you know, very stovepiped and very one way. And somehow you have to surmount that. There are ways of doing that digitally. I think we're trying to do that today a little bit, but I think that's the key.
Thanks, Kathy. I've often been amused by the fact that people say, you know, the U.S. is a leader in communications, so why don't we communicate? And they have instantly turned from a system developed nationally with decentralization and independence to thinking it should be run by the government. But I'm going to turn to Tom Pickering here. Tom, I'm going to come back to you if you can hear me. A number of questioners have asked a question, basically the same question, about whether current U.S. foreign policy has been over-militarized, and particularly, is there a gap between the actions of the Department of State and actions of the Department of Defense in how the U.S. engages around the world? And if so, what are those gaps and how might one change them? And we can let a couple of others have a crack at that if there's time left, but I really wanted to ask you to address that one. Whoop, we're not hearing you. Nope, you're not, we're not hearing you.
How's that? You can hear me now?
I can hear you
Okay. Yeah. Let me try a reasonably short answer to that. I think there are differences between the two. I think they center often around such questions as, you don't understand what I do, and therefore you're wrong. And that's obviously a hard thing to overcome. And I've spent my time talking a lot to military audiences about what diplomacy is and about how it works. And I have to tell you that if I had to give myself a mark, it would be close to total failure, because they have been in their own courses for years and years and years. And they rely on traditional strategy, and strategy is you win the conflict. And then when you win the conflict, everything comes down like manna from heaven, and it's a Hollywood movie, and you walk off hand in hand into the sunset. And we have seen, in fact, that that hasn't happened in Iraq, and it hasn't happened in Afghanistan. It happened in World War II. We did a lot of killing on the way, and we did a lot of cleaning up afterward. And the people who cleaned up afterward, even under MacArthur, were heavily civilianized. And so working out the political connotations of a military victory are things that basically have never really, I think, bothered the military. And I think also, and I found this in my few visits to Afghanistan, you may have found it more, a deep distrust of diplomats, that they were there to negotiate away everything hard won on the battlefield. And that as a result, they couldn't be trusted. And as a result, we as military had to overcome the question, and there was no good time to negotiate because the military situation was always going to get better. And having gotten better, it would be better for us to negotiate on that situation. So you just have to look now at Zal Khalilzad and what he's been trying to do in Afghanistan. And Ron, you know this better than I do, but I think that piece is important. I do think that over a period of time, more working together is required. And some of the big rifts, and I think you saw some of this in Afghanistan, you'd be more qualified than I to talk about the fact that where you have a very large American combat military deployment and where you have an embassy on the scene that has to do a lot of things as well, the relationship has never been defined. And it can't be defined in a way that puts a single person in charge in large measure because the backgrounds, the education, the way in which things have run don't lend themselves to making that happen, particularly in the American system. And I have no easy answer for that of who should be in charge. Essentially, I think the best places have been where each side consulted with the other, appreciated each side had different views, respected the role of each other in terms of what had to happen, and worked as hard as they could to be mutually supportive. And I suspect that's really the only answer here. In the long run, my sense is that wars of choice have not turned out to be very good for us. In the 19th century, they were okay. But I think increasingly they have not been. And obviously, the larger the conflict, the harder it is to end. Grenada was a different story, Panama. But when you got into much larger places with much more controversy and much more civilian involvement and much more asymmetrical warfare, those were very hard. So I would never advocate wars of choice, even if it looked like an easy slam dunk. And I think the final thing, the role of diplomacy is to avoid having to go to war, but to do it with the superb military establishment that's right there next to it, making sure that everybody knows that we have this superb military establishment, and that the superb military establishment, as long as it gets into endless wars, is not going to be the kind of useful diplomatic leverage that we would like to see. So those are the conundrums we face now in the over-militarization and what I would call the re-diplomatization of the situation. The truth is neither of us can live without the other. Neither of us can serve the United States without the other. Each of us needs to do a much harder job in figuring out how to make that happen. We need to have a greater resolution on strategy that I would hope would be, talk first, fight later. And that would be a much clearer way to deal with our interests, and that increasingly the complex nature of warfare in this particular time does not lend itself to easy victories. And easy victories don't necessarily lend themselves to perfect political settlements.
Tom, thank you. As you know, since I retired from Afghanistan in 2007, I've made regular trips back, almost one a year, until COVID got in the way. And I have noticed times when the relationship between the civilians and the military was pretty poor, as you say, but I've also seen many other times when, in fact, the military has been asking for more help from the department. And this is a perennial of American incapacity, is that when the military asks for help, we don't have it to give because we don't have enough people. In fact, Nadia Shadlow's book points out the first time I at least saw it documented a military request for American help from the State Department to come help with governance was in Mexico in 1848. And the State Department couldn't produce enough people then to meet the request. And I thought of that about 2013. I was talking to one division commander, I think in Kandahar in Afghanistan. This was when we were supposed to be having the diplomatic surge, and he wanted more diplomats, but his comment was, "I feel the diplomatic surge lapping at my ankles." And we couldn't quite come up with the people.
I think it's true, Ron, and the really interesting question is that our diplomatic service is not a colonial service.
No.
And making it into a colonial service takes a lot of hard work and much change. And we've had some experiences with colonial services, but happily, I think we've mainly gotten out before we got in too deep.
I think you're right. We have about 4 more minutes. We've got, at least 15 questions out there, and probably more coming, but I'm going to give each of the panel plus just a minute and a half to answer one, and that it comes from the UNC Study Abroad office. And it says, do you have recommendations for our students to prepare them to further U.S. diplomatic relations or international relationships, perhaps as alternatives, opportunities to joining the Foreign Service? So it's, do you have recommendations to prepare them to further U.S. relations and alternatives to the Foreign Service? And I'm gonna wait for Tom to sweep up. And I think, Steve, do you want to drop some thoughts here? Oop, you're on mute. Okay.
Well, we have an entire domain of non-governmental organizations that are highly developed and influential and diverse in their ability to project influence and values beyond our borders, and to forge alliances and partnerships. And many of them are familiar to you. Some of them are operational groups like CARE or International Medical Corps or International Rescue Commission. Others are more along the lines of Open Society Institute or Doctors Without Borders, which is more of an international group. So there's that whole domain of institutions that further America's interests overseas. I think clearly the business sector, we've talked a bit about that as an illustration. The business sector is playing an ever larger role today and becoming an advocate. It seems to me a much stronger advocate for U.S. leadership as the U.S. has stepped back or regressed in its official positions. We've seen the business sector becoming a much more forceful advocate in many different respects. I'll just stop there. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity, Ambassador, to be with you today.
No, it's great having you. We're obviously, each of us could start over for a new lecture on this topic, but Kathy, I'm going to turn to you next for a couple of thoughts about this whole idea of how students can prepare to further U.S. diplomatic relations.
I would just say be intellectually curious and open to the world. And since the question comes from study abroad, if you have a chance to study abroad, study abroad. But if you don't, I mean, we have plenty of opportunities here in our own country, which we're understanding in a rather painful way now, to try to stretch our minds and stretch our hearts to understand, and I don't mean this in some really touchy-feely way, or maybe, but understand another perspective better. And if that requires learning a language, I don't think Google Translate will ever replace learning a language, because with a language comes a different way of thinking and getting outside your own head. And once you do that and you see it from the perspective, you understand your own country better, whether it's its foreign policy or its history. And I think it equips you to do a whole range of work in the world, not only in the traditionally defined diplomatic area.
Boy, is that true about language. I remember in Iran once being with a longtime employee of the consulate in Tabriz, where I was then assigned, and his English was so good, we usually spoke English. And we were coming back from a long trip, and he was driving, and for some reason we switched the conversation into Persian and Farsi. And all of a sudden there was another personality coming out. And it wasn't that he'd been hiding something or was dissimulating, it was just that when he moved into Persian, he was expressing thoughts in a different way. It's so true. Barbara, you're teaching, you're responsible for teaching all these people, but we'll still give you a couple of minutes on this.
So I think that that's a great question from Study Abroad, and it probably comes from knowing that there are really very few slots in the Foreign Service. There's only 8,000 Foreign Service officers and 6,000 Foreign Service specialists. So if there aren't very many, and the hiring numbers are about 300 a year in a pretty good year, and we haven't had a really good year yet. So there aren't that many slots, but I like to say that it's a really broad network now. When I started my career, as a junior officer in Panama, I remember getting the Panamanians to join the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade with about 5 conversations with the Minister of Economy and Finance, a deputy minister, and 2 business people. So you could get things done with a handful of elites. You can't do things that way anymore. And so it's a big, broad network conversation. The NGOs that Steve referred to are absolutely indispensable partners. Business is all over. It wasn't when I started, it is now. Join Procter & Gamble, they're everywhere, but there are many multinationals. Study abroad, absolutely. Join the Peace Corps. UNC produces, it's the top 4 Peace Corps provider in the country. Kathy started her long career with Korea as a Peace Corps volunteer. And I think that's a great way to do it. And so are some of the Peace, War, and Defense major provides lots of great foreign national security experts that work for DIA and National Geospatial and CIA. There are many ways to come in and be part of this. The Foreign Service is only one of those ways. But read The Economist is why I signed it, guys. Start reading, read The Economist, read a non-American perspective that takes a survey of the world every week. It'll be good for your head and it'll open up that curiosity that Kathy talked about.
And on that note, Tom Pickering, will you take us home on this question of how to prepare to help American diplomacy?
I can't say anything that is any better than the 4 of you have wound up with. So I won't go over time, but just to say, I thought it's been fascinating hearing from you all, your examples and the information you put on the table. I hope the students will find interesting. I hope even a few will consider the Foreign Service exam and joining the Foreign Service. We need you. You're the future. The time has never been more ripe for what you can do as diplomats, and I hope we'll see you at some point in the service and leading the service the way those 3 people who have spoken to you today on the panel have done so. So thanks very much. Thank you, Ron. Thank you again, Sisco family, and Carol. Thank you all very much for being here. It was great to join you and a real honor for me.
Tom, thank you. Kathy, Barbara, Steve, thank you, Carol, for having kept us and being here. And to echo a thought there, to amplify a thought Tom made, people look at the Foreign Service now sometimes and they say, well, there are all these problems, or we don't like this policy. I just like to remind people, 37 years in my career, there were certainly nights I went home that I was unhappy with how a decision came out. But I never once in 37 years went home and questioned whether what I was working on mattered. And there aren't that many places in the world you could say it. So on that note, I'm going to pass us back to our Vice Provost, Ambassador Barbara Stephenson, to close us out.
Thank you so much, Ron. And I'd like to thank everybody who's stayed with us for this discussion tonight. I would particularly like to thank Ron, Ambassador Pickering, Kathy, Steve. Thank you all for the thought you put into this, for participating, and the Sisco family. I loved the idea that Tom floated there, that we need to re-diplomatize the way we do foreign policy. That might be our topic for next year, which I'm going to end with thanking Ambassador Newman, President of the American Academy of Diplomacy, for his public commitment to hold the Sisco Forum here in Chapel Hill again next year. And at Passover, Jews say next year in Jerusalem. I'm going to end this with next year in person. Thank you so much, Ron.
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you all who listened, and good night.
Good night.
Night.